All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Oncology Innovation Panel for RESI. Really excited to do this virtually, kind of a new modality and an interesting experience, but excited to kind of talk about oncology innovation. My name is Travis Whitfill. I'm a partner at BIOS Partners, and we invest in early stage life sciences companies. And I'm involved with a couple of different oncology companies, including AI for discovering new oncology drugs, and also am on board of Incisys, which is developing cell therapies for oncology. So I think we'll start off by introducing the panelists and just have them go off individually. So on my screen, Scott is first up, so we'll start with Scott.
Okay, so thanks, Travis, and thanks everyone for tuning into the panel. My name is Scott Wiener. I'm a partner at AMZAC Health. AMZAC Health is an evergreen fund. It's based in New York City, been around for about 6 years. We invest most of our capital in private companies, about 50-50 split between biotech and medtech, and a minority in public biotech investments. On the private side, our bite size is 15 to 25 million through the life of a company and 7 to 12 million initially. Our focus is about 1 year prior to INDs. We want to have a lead asset identified and fund through phase 2 proof of concept. We're really agnostic in terms of the approach to disease areas. Obviously, we have a high interest in oncology just based on the number of companies in the space. I joined at the beginning of the year to lead our biotech effort. As far as my background, I've been a buy-side investor for 19 years. Prior to AMZAC, I was a partner at a firm called Pappas Ventures, where I spent 13 years, and then at 2 other venture funds and a hedge fund.
Great. Next on my screen is Ian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for including me in the panel. I'm Ian Walters. I'm a physician scientist. I started as an entrepreneur in residence at Medic Ventures and started their oncology vertical, which sits in Portage Biotech. And we are sort of like an incubator group. We take a very active role in managing companies. So we've started 7 companies in the oncology space, almost all in the immuno-oncology space. We're a bunch of former BMS executives that have, I guess we have together something like 5 oncology approvals under our belt. So we have a pretty good experience in what it takes to get drugs through the process. And, you know, our group is pretty much agnostic to modality, to geography. We really look for opportunities where we can provide, we can provide significant, I'm gonna have to unplug my phone because I can't turn the volume off. We can provide capital and also kind of commercial and drug development expertise to help programs get to human proof of concept with the hope that we can then partner them off to big pharma. And, you know, we have a flexible set of backers financially, so we don't have a specific size, but we usually like to be first money in and really help set the course for the products going forward.
Great. And Mike?
Well, Mike Krebs. So I am a scientist by training in immunology, and then worked as a consultant for a number of years before jumping into VC. And so I'm with Bright Edge, and Bright Edge is the venture fund of the American Cancer Society. We are funded 100% by the ACS. So all of our money comes straight off the ACS balance sheet. So we're only investing in oncology companies. That said, pretty much anything within oncology therapeutics is fair game. We made a few investments in diagnostics and healthcare IT last year, but going forward, we're kind of only focused on therapeutics. Only about 15 months old at this point, so still kind of getting our feet wet. But typically speaking, I guess I don't know what typically means really now, but typically speaking, we are looking at kind of a initial bite of maybe 2 to 4 million. Total investment over the life of a company is maybe in the $5 to $15 million range. So We're not writing, huge checks, but we feel that we kind of bring the brand awareness of the American Cancer Society and kind of the implicit endorsement of the ACS to our investments. And then we can also kind of, add value to our portfolio companies and our syndicate partners by using the resources behind the brand. And so that might be, clinical trial site selection or a lot of different things, press releases, et cetera. It's kind of different for each company. Let's see, I think that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think to, kind of kick off the conversation, what's your strategy for looking for innovation in oncology? Is there a treatment modality, whether it's cell therapy or small molecule antibodies, a certain indication or target? Kind of what drives your strategy in looking for innovation in oncology? Feel free to just dive in.
Are we going to go in the same order, or do we want to raise?
Why don't you start, Ian?
As I indicated previously, we're sort of agnostic to geography and modality, and we have a mix of small molecules, proteins, particles, liposomes, you name it. We're really looking for first-in-class, best-in-class potential, and ones where we think from a proof of concept perspective, we have a very clear gating experiment, both preclinically and then in the clinic. We wanted to make sure we have a clear patient population, ideally a way of selecting for that patient population we think is going to have the most benefit from a therapy, as well as a clear commercial angle that we think would be attractive for a big pharma partner. So, for example, in the field of immuno-oncology, we have a lot of interest in turning, cold tumors hot, addressing PD-1 based resistance and so on and so forth. We tend to shy a little bit away from the cell therapy space because it's not kind of core to where our experience level is, and the level of investment and the value proposition is a little bit different from conventional therapeutics. We're also interested, as someone, I think Scott mentioned, the AI space and repurposing drugs and things, again, where there's a very clear experiment that's going to unlock value. And that's always, may not be evident when we meet entrepreneurs in this space. And then through our diligence process, we were able to find those kind of pockets and help new companies figure out strategies to generate value.
I can go second. So as I mentioned, our fund invests across different therapeutic areas. So oncology is an important focus for us in general, and from my experience long-term as an investor. I think I read something in a magazine maybe a month ago that oncology last year made up about 35% of investment dollars into private companies. So, about maybe 1 out of 3 companies then maybe are oncology focused. So it's obviously an important space to play in. And if you look at our portfolio, that's probably about the same percentage we try to cover with investments in oncology. So what do we look for? It's kind of similar maybe to what Ian said. I think first and foremost for us, taking a step back, is the team. So the more experience the team has directly in oncology and in the space they're focused on, the better for us. Team is number one. Second is it's got to have a promising asset. And so what do I think is a promising asset? So for me, as Ian mentioned, we focused on, pretty similar to him, first-in-class or best-in-class opportunities. And we're agnostic to the two. I think there's different potential for each of them, but it's really important for us to have one of those two. As far as treatment modality, it just has to be the right modality to be effective. That can be small molecule, can be antibodies, et cetera. It can be immuno-oncology. But for us, it's got to be a story where you're linking, target to modality to disease state to make sure we can connect the dots and see something that's efficacious. We don't get involved in pure spin-offs from academia and startups. That's really early stage. So what we like to see typically is initial validation in some way, and that can be preclinical, ideally in vivo rather than in vitro. As I mentioned, we prefer to have lead assets identified, and we like to understand mechanistically validation, some type of differentiation to standard of care, and importantly, making sure you're targeting a right market opportunity that will benefit us based on our investment risk. So we've made a lot of investments in oncology that have been preclinical stage, and that's fine, but we just don't go too early where you just have a thesis. And then finally, as I mentioned on the market opportunity, we've been historically focused on a lot of orphan and rare disease opportunities, and that can play out in the oncology space as well. It's just important to us in oncology, which is a much more complicated treatment landscape once you get commercial stage, is trying to figure out where our product would fit in. So it can be an orphan indication where we treat enough patients where or the competition is lower, that's of high interest, or it can be a large market opportunity. We just need to understand where we would fit in terms of treatment lines commercially, again, to make sure the risk reward is favorable.
That's great.
Yeah, and so I guess from our perspective, a couple parts to the question. I think indication, we're 100% oncology focused, obviously being associated with ACS. Within, I guess, sub-indications, we try to balance, so we're kind of investing for two reasons. We're investing, one for return, and two equally, these are kind of not first and second, but both kind of equal weight, alignment with the ACS mission. And so, like Ian and Scott said, we are looking for best in class and or first in class, simply because, I guess from our perspective, there is money to be made off of a fourth in class PD-1, for example, but it's not really going to change patient lives necessarily. As kind of the part of the ACS mission is to really drive outcomes, and then again to get a financial return. Unfortunately, in oncology, there's no shortage of those opportunities that are both going to align with mission and also provide returns. So I think from our perspective, indication is really a balancing act between what are the markets that have room to generate revenue, and simultaneously what are the markets that have a good amount of unmet need. So just kind of the balancing act there. And then in terms of modality, really indifferent. We're driven by data. So small molecule versus antibody versus cell therapy doesn't matter at all. And there's a lot of kind of new buzzwords about different therapies, and that's great. But there's repurposed platinum agents that are going to be fantastic fourth line options for a lot of patients. And so that's, something that might not be kind of a real headline grabber, but can provide, I think, great, again, good patient outcomes and also a good financial return. So we're very indifferent when it comes to that. Again, as Scott kind of talked about, data, that's where our primary interest is going to be. What's the preclinical data? And we're fine if there's no inpatient data, that's fine. But good, strong animal data. We get a lot of people that I think rush to, try to raise money, I think, before properly generating the data they need. And I think it's kind of, they're doing themselves a disservice. I think they end up getting lower valuations than they might have gotten, if they would have spent another, even just 2 or 3 months sometimes. So I think that kind of wraps us up.
That's great. So, kind of digging in a little bit more, is your strategy to look at, let's talk about therapeutics, for example, a single asset or a platform play? I think in oncology it might be a little bit different from, other spaces, but what's kind of your strategy in terms of when you're looking for a company, whether it's a full platform or a single asset play? Do you have a preference?
I can start. I think from our perspective, it's again, what does the data look like? I know we have some members on our investment committee that are very kind of anti-single asset. They say, what if the asset fails? And then we have other folks on the investment committee that kind of only want single assets because they say it's just kind of cleaner. It's going to be easier for M&A. It's, generally quicker development time. So there's pros and cons both ways, certainly. And it's, kind of the same conversation comes up often in our investment committee meetings where we have this conversation, and I think the outcome is always the same. It's just what does the data say?
Yeah, and for us, as all of us are, we're for-profit investors, and so our goal is to make money for our investors in our fund. And so we're agnostic as to the approach, single asset versus multiple shots on goal. I think, stepping back, I think my preference would be to have more than one shot on goal. That doesn't mean it can't be single asset. You could have a single asset that's targeting 2 different cancer indications, and there could be good validation for both. So for us, it's more of a de-risking strategy. If it's a single asset and we have invested in those type of companies, then it's a question of what's the market opportunity, what's the capital requirements, and can we still target, our return thresholds that need to be met. So sometimes in single asset opportunities that could be more challenging, but when you get to the larger platforms, they're a lot more capital intensive. So it's really a balancing act for us, and we obviously build our own models to understand what the risk is and what our return thresholds are. In general, my experience, even investing in a bunch of oncology companies, in many cases, you kind of are what your lead program is. So when you get initial data, that really kind of drives, value of your company. And so that's really important to understand, what the opportunity is in front of us. But what's interesting for me to note is of a lot of oncologies I've been invested in over the past, success doesn't always come from, the lead program. And some of the biggest wins I've had, they've come from second or third programs. So that's going back to making sure we have the right team in place that knows, what to prioritize and when, and investors around the table to make sure there's capital available to really drive the company's potential to fruition.
Sure. Yeah, our group, really we have the expertise, right? So we have the ability to augment a team if they don't have all the expertise that you want to see in a company on day one, which is one of our value propositions. I mean, we're a lot like Third Rock in the sense that we have our extended family, very senior executives with 20 to 30 years of experience that we bring to bear on any company that we develop. We try to have, by intent, a variety of things, including platforms and single asset plays. It really depends on, how we think we can create value, what the exit strategy is for a given technology. I'll give you an example. We formed a company from scratch based on a hypothesis that we made while we were at BMS about how to get more people into long-term response or cure. And we went out, we sought the platform, we sought products to put in the platform and the people to put together. We put together the whole company and promise from scratch with a clear objective of getting a early proof of concept in animals and then licensing it to other companies that we know have interest in this area. So that was a strategy from company initiation, not necessarily to get to human proof of concept, but to take a platform, validate it enough that we could get license revenue to allow us to expand the platform into other areas without investors having to carry the brunt of the investment. We have other companies where they have clinical assets, it's a single asset, and we say, all right, well, the goal here is to get to human proof of concept and to license or find an M&A target. So we look for a mix of different business strategies. I think ideally, since we have the drug development expertise, almost everything we've done has been a platform technology with multiple products. And I agree with Scott. The first company that we did was getting ready to put their lead asset into the clinic. We came in, we asked them to do some additional experiments. They confirmed that the lead asset wasn't optimal, and we went with a backup asset that was further behind, but had much better properties that we think would provide more value in the long run. So, it's nice when you have options and you have a good team of people that can look at the broader picture to figure out, it might not be the quickest path, but the path we think that could generate the most value.
And just to echo something else that Scott said, single asset is fine, but got to make sure you have a backup plan. I mean, if you've only got one drug and you're going into GBM and that's it, that sure is a risky investment. So, having a couple different indications in case the first one fails is perfectly acceptable if you've only got one drug.
Yeah, it's great. I think, sometimes companies will come up with, in other indications within oncology that make sense, or have a really good medicinal chemistry program and come up with, other assets that are derivatives that are next gen compounds of the same drug. So I think there's a lot of plays there. So shifting gears a little bit, in your diligence process, in terms of all the different things that you look for in a company, what's your kind of diligence process look like? Obviously there's data, but there's, so much more in a company. I think one of you mentioned the team, but what are some of the, what's your diligence process like, and what are the key factors that you kind of look for?
I could start that one. Our group has done, BD for major pharma companies for many, many years and have looked at thousands of different opportunities. So since we have our own people, we do obviously due diligence on people, but we do very, very deep technical diligence. I would say one of the areas that we find most challenging with companies is CMC. Most startups underestimate the complexity and the difficulty in getting, product ready for human use. So we spend a lot of time on CMC diligence. Probably what makes us a little bit unique and perhaps different from some of my other panelists is we have very, very strong relationships with the development groups and the BD groups of the companies that are most likely to acquire our assets. And we take the extra diligence step to sort of vet things with the potential acquirers up front and say, what do you need to see to want to have this in your portfolio, and so on and so forth, to kind of really know what our bar is as a combined entity of our group and the investee company, to really get this to a point where there's, hopefully a competitive interest for the product on the back end. So that part of the diligence is critical for us because, we want to have a very clear bar for ourselves to put in more money, to understand what we need to achieve, and so on. So I think, I don't think a lot of investor groups go that distance, but that's something that we pride ourselves in.
Yeah, I'll follow on. So, we do, very deep technical diligence, as well as I'm sure every investor does, trying to understand mechanistic rationale, if they're in the clinic, patient by patient data and response, understanding the right models run, et cetera, even on the in vivo side. So, I think hopefully, every group is doing that as well. I think we also have a network of senior executives at the various large pharma biotech companies that, we try to interact with on a regular basis to understand, what areas they're looking for, as well as, as soon as the day we make the investment is the day we start thinking about how we exit, even though that takes a long time. So that's an important part of the process. I agree with Ian, CNC is becoming more complex, especially, for cellular therapies, et cetera. That's an important part of diligence. But for us, the hardest part, and I think the one that drives, the likelihood of success or not, is just the personnel aspect and the people. And so, especially in this COVID environment, it makes it even harder. So we've been fortunate to be, our team has been investors for a long time. And so we try to work with people that we've known in the past and have worked in the past together, and that really helps mitigate risk. But if we haven't, and that's okay, then we just need to spend a lot of time with the team, understanding, a little bit how they think, what their strategy is, how open-minded they are to change, which we think you have to know when to change, and that's an important part of building a company. And those are a little bit more subjective rather than objective diligence processes, which is harder to execute, but I think ultimately critical to success. We also really focus on how the syndicate is coming together of other investors, advisors, independent board members, etc., because that all also shapes the outcome. So we try to invest with investment funds and firms and people that we have worked with in the past, just because we know how they act in both bull markets and bear markets, and so that also mitigates risk. So for us, we just try to think about all the risks that we could face with the company and how do we mitigate them over time. And part of that is strong scientific diligence, and then part of it's the softer side, which is also equally important.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think we're all doing obviously a ton of scientific diligence here on everything. Full competitive landscape, full look at the MOA, et cetera. I think the one thing I want to kind of call out, and it's already been alluded to, but just personalities on the management team are these people I want to work with, fairly closely for the next 2 to 5 years. And critically, I think, what Scott said is being open-minded and amenable to change. And this is really especially true of early stage companies. If it's a Series A round, the CEO for the Series A might not be the best CEO for a Series C. And so I think kind of making sure that they understand that, or having that conversation early and saying, would you be willing to step down at some point? This really just kind of is in your wheelhouse, and would you be open to us bringing in a different management team? Is, I think, an important conversation to have. And if you get immediate pushback, this is my company, whatever, that's kind of a huge red flag for us.
Yeah, and what's the kind of profile of a CEO that you look for early on?
That's a great question. I think it's really different company by company. I think the biggest thing is that you're just adaptable. You're willing to take advice of people that have been through this before. The especially kind of from our perspective, the wealth of knowledge that we have with the the network of PIs and the American Cancer Society is incredible. And so making sure that you are receptive to the fact that they might have good suggestions for you, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah, we call it coachability.
There you go. That's exactly. Yeah.
That's a very important quality. Scott or Ian, do you have any comments on the CEO profile or management team?
Yes, the CEO obviously is a pretty important role in these companies, and again, I think it's all about, for us, just spending sufficient time so we can be comfortable with how we think that person will react in both good times and bad, how open-minded they are, how flexible, how they think about building their team, etc. And so, before the code environment, we, as probably a lot of groups do, we try to do site visits with companies, spend a lot of time with management. Just the social interaction and going out to dinners on these trips with them is really important, because you can see how people interact, not just in a professional setting, but in a more relaxed setting, and you actually sometimes learn more in those situations than you do when you're just around a table in a boardroom, discussing diligence questions. So I think, as Mike said, you just got to really understand skill sets of the individual and teams, what the holes are, how you can fill them, and then how you can partner with the senior executives of your company to ultimately build a successful enterprise. And sometimes that's with the team you start with, and sometimes it may not be. And knowing when you may need to change is also a challenge, part of the challenge, and also having other people around the table all aligned is important. So I think it's all about just communication and open-mindedness.
Yeah, our model is a little bit different. I mean, I act as CEO of most of our portfolio companies or executive chairman. So we have a very close connection to our companies. Um, and then obviously I look for people like me to be CEO of companies, either when I, you know, need to move on and step back, or when there's somebody who we exists already in the company and then they don't need me to step in to help. So one of the things that I think makes me unique is I'm well versed on the business side and the medical and science side. So we look for people that are not unidimensional, we look for people that are pliable and humble, because this is a very humbling job, as we can't predict what's going to happen in R&D and until you do the experiments, and there's always going to be unexpected um, twists and turns along the way. But I agree again with what Scott and Mike has said as far as this particular role, and know people and know how they behave outside of work and what kind of person they are, and is this somebody I want to spend time with? Because obviously there's a long-term relationship with these people, and you got to feel like these are people you want to be around. It's not that they're just the smartest guy in the room.
And,
Yeah.
I'll add one lesson I've learned, which was unfortunately the hard way, and it was not an oncology company, but we really fell in love with technology, but knew the CEO probably wasn't the right CEO. And we figured we'll make the investment, and everyone was aligned around the table in terms of the investors, and then we would change out the CEO after a few months. And that was just ultimately a mistake. We really didn't find like the perfect CEO. And so like for me, the lesson learned was, let's find the right CEO before we make the initial investment. Make sure you've got the right team in place before you start. So it just emphasizes how important that position is in these companies.
Agreed. Yeah. For us, we like to see a good operator early on that, maybe his external facing charisma may not be the, necessary at first, but at least is a really good operator, really good to work with. Totally echo what all of you have said.
And the one thing I'll add is we don't mandate that the CEO has been the CEO in the past of another company. I mean, that's helpful, but you don't have to be. I think, every CEO has been a first-time CEO at some point. And so I think for us, it's just, can we work with, is this the right person we think we can work together with successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, a couple minutes ago, you mentioned risks and COVID. So I'm curious, from our perspective, we haven't seen too much impact of COVID-19 in the oncology space. It seems like clinical trials are still kind of recruiting. But what are you guys seeing in terms of the impact of COVID-19 in oncology, and how has it kind of disrupted some of the clinical trials or any of the companies that you've worked with?
Yeah, I would say oncology, it's fortunate as a space because, it's a severe disease. And I think that's one area where in life-threatening disorders, their patients are still being treated. So from all the companies we're involved in and looked at, I think those trials are still running, as you stated. They may be running slower in terms of enrollment and recruitment than they have been in the past, but they're doing better than other therapeutic areas in terms of moving forward. So I think just based on the nature of the disease, that there's still progress being made. And as I think what we've noticed recently, and that's probably the last couple weeks, that things seem to be opening up a little bit more in terms of hospitals in general. So we're starting to see trial enrollment pick up now more than it did even a month to 2 months ago. So I think things are encouraging. I can't predict what the fall will look like. I'm probably a little bit more nervous about that, but we'll see how things play out.
I think from our perspective, so things definitely have been moving along, but I guess I was surprised to find out how many procedures in oncology are considered elective procedures. I mean, I don't know how you can say that, but there's a number of different surgical procedures and otherwise that are being, I think, postponed more than you'd expect. But again, to Scott's point, given the nature of the disease, there are still, treatment is still going to happen. It just may be a little bit more difficult. I think where you're really seeing the impact is around the cell therapies. So, if you have a cell therapy where maybe there's only, I don't know, 15 or 20 sites in the country that can actually administer it, and they happen to be dealing with, other COVID stuff, they're probably not going to prioritize that. And their IRB is probably not going to let that happen. I think a lot of trials that were already in progress were able to kind of still push some patients through dosing. But companies that were just about to start, I think in cell therapy space, really got hit. So infusions, not so much. Small molecules, really not at all. But I think cell therapies where, which was, obviously a difficult place to be anyways, just because the novelty of it. I think they've had maybe some harder times from our perspective.
Yeah, a lot of our portfolio companies have been hit pretty hard. We've definitely seen on the phase 1 units significant slowdowns with many hospitals not being able to accrue new patients to studies. You can't monitor studies, right? Because you can't send a monitor over to the hospital to look at data, which creates pretty big backlogs of things. And, you don't want to get too far ahead without checking the data and all that kind of stuff. We've had several regulatory filings be delayed. Certain hospitals outside the US that we work with will not activate new studies. Mm-hmm. So even if you can get approval from the regulatory agency, you will not be able to start accruing. It's starting to ease up a little bit on that front. We've had manufacturers shut down where we can't, we have delays in manufacturing. We have academic labs where we do a lot of our preclinical work completely shut down, not allowing people in unless you're working on COVID. And it's kind of interesting, dynamic with immuno-oncology because the same kind of immunologic mechanisms that apply to fighting cancer do apply to COVID. Mm-hmm. And whether or not you should be shunting your teams to do COVID-related work or not, or is that a distraction? And, for a small startup, are you going to have any kind of meaningful contribution in time to make a difference in that area? But I think, go ahead, Mike. I mean, we've been hit hard.
Yeah, I think there's the question too of do you even want to be doing a clinical trial right now? It doesn't take much to, statistically go from statistical meaningfulness to not statistically meaningful. And hopefully if your drug is strong, it's strong. But, think about something like non-small cell lung cancer, for example, where you could theorize, right? Who knows? But you could theorize that this is a patient population that's going to get harder hit by pulmonary disease. And so, is that the difference between FDA approval and not? Probably not. But you could imagine a situation where if a certain number of your patients were in a hospital where they were doing a bunch of COVID treating, maybe that skews your numbers a little bit. I don't know. And I don't think it's a reason not to proceed, but it's just another question.
Yeah, we've also seen, some of these delays as well. For us, the companies that had already, cleared INDs before the pandemic started were pretty safe. But the ones that need to go through the IRB or file a new IND, those are the ones that have been really hit hard. So.
Yeah, Travis, we've seen the same thing as well. Ongoing studies, if, the investigators were excited, some, those were able to continue in a reduced fashion, but at least continue. But new studies, it's been more challenging. And frankly, anyone that's got to spend a lot of time in the hospital, that's been a little bit more challenging. So small molecules, as I think Mike said, a little bit easier.
Yeah. What about the impact on fundraising? Do you think, has it impacted how you invest? That might depend on whether your fund is raised or whatever, but has that, kind of impacted how you see the world in terms of investing?
No, it's an interesting question you bring up. So living through a couple other, downturns, especially kind of the 09, 10 period as an investor. I mean, that's when things dried up really quickly and investors were just nervous about reserves and extremely cautious. And that just really hasn't played out as much here. I mean, I think the activity level has been as high for us, at least, as it was, 6 months ago and a year ago. And that's in terms of, companies raising capital, but importantly, investments being made. So even in oncology, we're seeing a significant amount of companies raising money, which is more than I thought. I don't know how the data compares historically to, years past, but it's definitely more than I thought based in this COVID environment. And we're seeing companies go public, as everyone has seen, especially in oncology. In the last 4 or 5 companies that went public, Zentalis, Oric, even Pliant, Legend, ADC Therapeutics, I mean, they're all trading up meaningfully, and the books were significantly oversubscribed. So there seems to be, in this environment, a flight to maybe to healthcare a little bit and biotech, and there certainly seems to be a lot of interest in the space.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, most of our deals come through our network. So, that we're still getting referrals. We're still, evaluating technologies. I think things are moving a little bit slower for us than they normally do, because we can't have the same degree of face-to-face interaction and so on. And everything just seems to be going, in slow motion. But as Scott said, I remain encouraged by the volume of money going into the sector. People are still dying of cancer. We haven't cured everybody. So, there's still room for improvement. I've seen a lot of the same, which has been a little bit disappointing to me, as opposed to truly novel targets and novel approaches. And we're kind of holding out for the more novel programs that we think could really be a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
I think right now, I think really the private markets are attractive. It's just relatively safe place to park your money. And so for us, and I guess we're a little different because we really only have one LP, which is ACS, but from other people I've talked to, their LPs aren't really backing down. I think fundraising, that if you're trying to raise a fund, maybe like literally today, you might have some issues, but capital calls for funds that were raised 6 months ago, I haven't really heard of many problems. So I think the appetite is there on the part of the people that are funding the VC firms. And then, again, cancer is not going anywhere. Hopefully it is, but for the time being, it's not. And so there's going to be money to be made. And I think what's good is, I think pharma has taken a black eye, or maybe 2 black eyes over the past, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, whatever you want to call it. And I think the public is starting to think that maybe that was a little rash and not so deserved. And so I think, the biotech companies have been performing well lately, and I think it's going to be seen as a good place to put your money. And I think it's going to be seen, even just kind of, general public viewpoint is a maybe more respected industry, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So shifting gears a little bit, to kind of the exit strategy, a lot of you have already mentioned large pharma and M&A. Last year, we had a record year for oncology. By my count, about $115 billion in oncology M&A. Obviously, that was a lot driven by Celgene and some other large acquisitions and consolidation. But what's your kind of exit strategy in terms of I think Ian probably has a clear strategy with BMS, but what's your exit strategy in terms of M&A, partnerships, strategics, IPO? What do you like to kind of drive a company towards?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Okay, so Look, we're kind of agnostic between M&A and IPO, to be honest. Right now the public markets the last several years have been pretty robust. So sometimes you can get more value on the public side if your drug's doing well versus M&A. I think, Travis, to a point you made earlier, we don't really look at like the $115 billion number, whatever it is, on M&A. We're looking at how many private company acquisitions are there per year and what's the value of those to try to figure out how active groups are. When you see like two big pharma companies merge, that takes away one acquirer, and and one of them was pretty active historically in partnerships and M&A, and so we kind of, that's a little bit disappointing. But you've got other companies that are evolving and becoming commercial stage and building the revenue base, and eventually they'll become another acquirer of private companies. So we're excited as kind of mid-sized companies become some of these larger companies. So, right now the IPO markets, I think, are pretty robust, especially for oncology companies from my perspective. And then, it's a trade-off between, that and M&A. On the public side, the nice thing is we can decide when the risk reward turns unfavorable and take money off the table. And so we're okay making that decision on our own. On the M&A side right now, it just feels like there's a little bit more companies, more exits on the public side than private M&A right now. And so that's something that we just try to take note of, is figure out the right exit path for companies, and then making sure our private companies are built correctly to have the potential to access the public markets as they remain open. So on the private side, our philosophy is companies are bought and not sold. And so, we don't encourage our companies to try to, make the rounds to big pharma and say, hey, look, we're for sale, we want to partner this and that. We encourage companies to generate good data, update their pharma colleagues and it's important to meet those groups at conferences or whatever, and just make sure people are updated and let the data speak for itself. And in an environment where you have, an IPO path that's very viable, I think that can, force the pharma companies to think a little bit more about, if and when they should acquire.
Just only thing I have to add is anytime you're doing a partnership, just be really careful. In terms of IPO versus M&A, we're indifferent. I mean, obviously go with whichever one's going to give you more money. But partnerships, just, especially early on when you might really need the capital, don't get into anything restrictive, because it's just going to make your life a lot harder downstream to try to raise more capital.
Yeah, I think Mike brings up a really good point. So partnerships from our perspective can be both good or bad. I mean, I think, as Mike said, you bring in some capital, you bring in some validation and maybe expertise. And I think that's really helpful for small companies. But the question is, like, what are you giving up? Are you giving up meaningful rights to your lead program? Will development continue as fast as it has in the past with a small, nimble company? Are your exit options limited? So that's everything we think about on the partnership side. And so if you're going to partner your lead asset, for any company out there, just take a step back and think about what you're giving up, what's remaining at the company. Can you somehow get US rights or sufficient rights where there's still a path for another party that would want to acquire you? I think that all those topics need to be thought through as you enter into partnerships versus M&A.
Yeah, Travis, our strategy is a little different since we're like owner operators. We're always looking for the best, return on investment. And to me, that's usually through an M&A, because we're thinking a little bit longer term. But we, have done well with the public markets and some of our companies in the past. And it really depends on how much capital they need to get to the biggest value creation. So, for example, one of the companies we started was Biohaven. That's a neuroscience company. Second largest IPO in 2017. Our investment did really well, but they ended up needing to raise enough money to commercially launch, a neuroscience product, which is a lot of money, and that money was unlikely to be available in the private markets. And I think a better choice was to go to the public markets. We dividended out those shares to our shareholders, and they had the option of holding them or selling them. But it really depends on the capital needs and where we think the value is likely to be greatest. I would say we lean towards M&A, and just because I worked at BMS doesn't mean that's the only company that could potentially acquire our products. We try to create competitive demand amongst all the companies in this space, but that's kind of how we operate.
Great. So we're coming towards the end of the hour. Kind of last question. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs who are starting off in oncology to really differentiate themselves and distinguish themselves from other companies in other competition? Do you have any advice to kind of early stage entrepreneurs?
I can start. I think maybe the biggest thing for me is just kind of be upfront and truthful about what you have, and don't, I don't know how many decks I get where the first slide is we're going into a $87 billion market. No, you're not. I mean, you either don't know the space or you think I'm stupid. And that to me is a huge turnoff. You need to really walk a fine line between selling, but also showing that you know the space. I guess, to me, that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I would add that, and Mike makes a great point there, like obviously know your addressable market. But, I would tell, emerging entrepreneurs to be able to, I guess, succinctly articulate your value proposition, back that up with whatever data you have, understand the next key experiments you need to run or trials that will further validate the thesis, understand what your key risks are. I think I hate when I uncover something that, weeks into diligence that the company clearly knew about, and it wasn't that they were hiding, but we had to figure it out on our own. And just be upfront and transparent with people and say, hey, like, here's our strengths, here's what we have to overcome. Build, first impressions are important. So when you meet with investors the first time, I think that's, you only get one first impression. So I think that's important. And, as we talked before, just be open-minded. You may have a path, and then you may meet with a bunch of investors, and, there may be a different strategy that evolves that may or may not be the right one for your company, but it could be.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, just know your investor, who you're pitching to. So, for example, I don't need 5 slides on oncology background. I don't need 5 slides on how big the lung cancer market is.
Right.
It sort of sets a bad taste in your mouth when, I am 10 slides to the deck yet, and I still haven't learned anything meaningful about why this company is, I should, continue to waste my time with them. So I would do that. We're big on really understanding the landscape, and not the landscape today, but the landscape when your product's coming to the market. And what are all the things in development that are ahead of you, that have tried this before and failed, or tried this before and shelved it at big pharma because of X, Y, and Z. Like, you really need to understand the landscape and why you think you're able to succeed where others may have failed, or where others are headed with more resources than you, and why you think you can be competitive in that landscape. And we often don't see that. The other thing that we don't see, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean we wouldn't invest. I mean, it just means that you need our help more to kind of understand these things. Is to understand all the things it takes to get there, right? And it's perfectly fine if you don't understand those and you kind of say that up front. But people have this distorted thing. Oh, we're gonna launch 3 INDs in Q3. Yeah, you're probably not going to launch 3 INDs in 1 quarter with 5 people in the company. It's just, those kind of things. Like, you have to have some grounding in reality and what it takes to to actually get a successful product into the clinic, and so on and so forth. So, having a grounding in that. And if you don't have that, there's consultants, there's people, look, if you're upfront and say, look, we're scientists, we don't know what it takes, we need help in trying to figure out these things. That's why we're coming to you. That's fine. But don't come in and say, oh, we have a budget of this amount of money, we're gonna launch 3 INDs in this quarter. It's not, gonna start the conversation off on good footing.
Totally agree. Really awesome advice, and thank you all so much for being on this panel. I think we're about at the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and stop there. But thanks again for coming and sharing your insights in oncology innovation. And thanks to RESI for having us.